Okay, good morning. I'm going to get started because it's 9:30 and it's on the dot. Yes. There's some folks that are coming in. James Goldfarb just texted me to save the good stuff till he gets here. And there is some good stuff in Satan and Goray. Huh? It's 63 degrees. But it's a lot. That's a lot warmer than 53, which was yesterday. So, yeah. Okay, so we had chosen 3 books. I chose 3 books to read this year, and then we were supposed to do this earlier, and it got bumped. So what's not on the schedule is the next one is March 23rd. Then we're going to plug in the tentative date is May 18th, which I think we penciled out because I know that I will be here on the May 18th. So on March 23rd, we'll do the Josh Cohen, so we can do the Netanyahu's, and then the Philip Roth we can do in May 18th. That's out of order, but there was a Philip Roth book that I picked. Yeah. Or we can do, you can decide which order, but but anyway, we got 2 more dates, so we missed the first one, but we'll schedule in the third. So should we say we'll do the Netanyahu's? I don't remember the original order. Okay, we'll read the Netanyahu's. We'll discuss that on March 23rd. And the Philip Roth book, I don't remember which one I picked, but I know I picked one. No, I picked one because I've already talked about, I already gave a lecture on that a few years ago. Rabbinical Cantorial Master's Students. And I teach, one of the courses I teach is sort of medieval and early modern Jewish history. And in that course, when we do Sabbatai Zevi, which is what this is about, I actually assign them this instead of like heavy history reading. Gershom Sholom's book on Sabbatai Zevi, I have it right next door. It's literally this thick. So it's like it's about 1,100 pages, small print with tiny, tiny footnotes. So the students were grateful for this. So it's all about expectations, see? So yes, of course. Yes, of course I did. So, yes. And I'm teaching that course again now. So I have a sign. So I read it. I reread this yesterday for today. It's my 3rd time reading through it. So, and every time I even like it better. So maybe because it's less scandalizing when you know what's coming. So read it again if you want. This was Isaac Bashevis Singer's first book. It's his first novel. So he wrote it when still living in Poland in 1933. So one of our congregants was saying, well, you said you're doing American Jewish writers. He's really Polish. Does he count as American? So Isaac Bashevis Singer moved to America in 1935. He moved 4 years before the Nazis invaded Poland. But apparently because he knew what was happening next door, right? And it's actually an interesting, somewhat controversial biography because he left a wife and child behind. And he moved, and they split up, and he remarried when he got here. His wife and son moved to Palestine then, became Israel. He went to America, and then he before he moved to America, he was kind of a lost soul. He went to rabbinical school. He didn't like it. His father was a Hasidic rabbi. And then he went to move to New York, and then he did some editing and literary writing, working for his brother. And then eventually he found himself as a Yiddish writer, which he had already started. And when this was first published, Satan and Goray, it was published in serial. So like in a Yiddish literary journal that was published in Warsaw, I imagine. You read the novel in series, and then it was put together. And then this is the English version, which was translated, I think it's 1955. I don't know the exact year there. It was around the 1954, mid-50s when it was translated into English. And he worked directly with the translator. The reason why I give him credit as an American Jewish writer is from 1935 to 1991, he lived in the United States, which is where most of his career, a lot of his Yiddish, he translated and was involved with the translation to English, and then he started writing some in English. Also, he won the Nobel Prize in 1978, something like that, and he is buried 10 minutes from here at Cedar Park Bethel Cemetery. I did look up his grave once. I don't remember offhand. I can give you the map. I have the map at home, so I can, or if... They have it in the office. That's how I found it. You have to give a name. You say, I want to visit Isaac Bashevis Singer. You have to spell his name right so they can look it up in the computer. Or I'm happy to go, if you want to schedule a time with me, have a little field trip. I would do it after class today, but I have a Hebrew high school, and then I'm actually going to be at the cemetery later for a cemetery. So, but I'm happy to take a field trip because I know where it is because I found it. You want to go on the field trip?
No, I will go there all the time. I have friends and relatives there.
And a Nobel laureate too.
And they will talk to each other.
Yes.
No, I have a question. So is this maybe why his writing is so dark? Because he started out with his life, as you explained?
Why is lighting is so dark? It could be this writing. I mean, he also wrote a lot. As a kid, I read his children's literature. It was great, and it brought like traditional Judaism to life for me. And I always thought of him as a children's author. And but this is obviously not a children's book, right? So it could. Yeah. But he won the Nobel Prize. It says on his tombstone, it says Nobel laureate, right? And it's written in Yiddish script, and it's so I can again. I'm happy to. It's right there in Cedar Park, buried right here. So he's our most local famous Jewish writer. So we definitely have claim, and that's why I got excited when I knew that when I was teaching him in my AJR class, and then was just reading about Isaac Bashevis Singer. He lived in the New York area, retired to Florida. He died in Florida, but then he's buried here in Cedar Park. And I said, "Oh my God, he's buried in Paramus." Yes, Linda. Uh-huh. Right. Is that his story or? That he has an affair and that's right. It was a common law wife. Somehow they got some kind of home because he did marry here. He married someone that he met in the late 30s, I think. So after being here for 4 or 5 years, he fell in love and got married. So, but there were a lot of broken marriages over the displacement because of the war and trying to get out of Europe. So that was part of his story. Yeah. Okay. So go into the book. Some of you did not like it, I get this sense? Initially. See, it grows on you. Okay.
In fact, I made Nancy read the first 3 pages and asked him if I would like it.
What did he say?
He said, I think so.
Oh, good. Linda. Like magic realism. Okay. Well, then I spoiler alert. I'm going to tell you what happens at the end. Okay. Any other just quick reactions? Yeah. Ann. Good. Okay. Yeah. We'll talk about the historical accurate. Yeah. Right. Sharon. No comment. Thumbs down. Okay. So let's start with the historical accuracy. So this is historical fiction, right? So the characters in the book are all fictional, except for Sabbatai Zevi and Nathan of Gaza, right? His prophet. Those are real people. That's a real event. And Khmelnytsky with the great Khmelnytsky pogrom of 1648. Right, that's a true event, which was devastating for Polish Jewry in 1648. So the way that's described, starting in the first chapter, is very accurate. And then the Sabbatean movement, which comes to a head in 1655. And there were a whole series of false messiahs, but Sabbatai Zevi. It's probably the most, if you could pick 3 messianic, there are many, there are like hundreds in Jewish history, but you could pick, I would say 4 that are the top 4, the final 4. And I won't say in order, I'll just give you chronological order. The 4 top contenders for Messiah in Jewish history. The first is Jesus. Second would be Bar Kokhba, right? And the third is Sabbatai Zevi, And the fourth is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Schneerson. Those would be my top four, right, for claimants to be Messiah. And we were we're actually just talking at our board meeting last week. It came up, and then I was talking with something afterwards that Maimonides says the definition of a false Messiah is a Messiah who dies before the world is redeemed. So, which applies to all four in a sense from a technical Jewish theological perspective. So Sabbatai Zevi is there, and it's a worldwide movement. What made the Sabbatean movement different, well, similar to those other three, putting Schneerson aside, is that it covered the entire, well, you can include Schneerson, it covered the entire Jewish world, that people were swept up in the movement from both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic world. It wasn't localized. Sabbatai Zevi he's from the Ottoman Empire, right, from Greece. And then the story of Sabbatai's life takes place in Greece and Palestine, Egypt, and Turkey. And nevertheless, it has such an effect into Jews living in Germany and Poland, Germany and France and Holland. And what's talked about in the book, where it swelled up so much that people started selling their possessions at a loss, which is unusual in Jewish economic cult history, right? And because they believed that they were going to be and a lot of this is based on mystical speculation that was popularized in the Sabbatean movement. But they did believe that a cloud would come and they would be transported on the cloud that would lift them up and take them to Israel. So that's why they were ready to go, but they weren't buying, passages to Israel over land passage and seafaring. They were expecting a cloud to just pick them up. And that was and there was this just exaltation. And while the 1648 story doesn't apply to people in the Eastern world, for those who experience the amount of persecution in 1648, it's understandable where there was this sense that we've suffered at the lowest amount of suffering, so clearly a great redemption must be coming. And it spread like a fever through the Jewish world. There's a famous Jewish woman called Gluckel of Hameln, who was a German Jewish merchant, and she's very famous because she has a whole memoir of all her business dealings, which is famous because she's a woman, right? We don't have that many examples of literature written by women that are historical documents. And in her memoirs, talks about how during this year, her family sold they sold everything. They were ready to go, believing that they were going to be redeemed and be sent to Israel. And it was popular in the Christian world also, and Christians believed that this, something was happening. It was also, they got to buy a lot of Jewish property at low rate also. So it spread, and it had an economic effect throughout Europe. And then what happens at the end, the real scandal, is what at the end of the book, when, right, Sabbatai Zevi, eventually the Sultan says, okay, convert to Islam or I'm going to have you executed, because he was a political threat, because claiming that he was going to take the Sultan's crown put on his head. So he accepts Islam, and he's under house arrest, and is in a fortress outside Istanbul, which they say Istanbul is Constantinople, right? And he marries a Muslim woman and converts to Islam and eventually dies. And that's the story of Sabbatai Zevi. Yes?
Is that what makes Sabbatai Zevi different from the other three messiahs?
It's a good point, yes, because he actually does take on another religion. Right, Jesus doesn't, his disciples do, right? Right, Jesus dies as a Jew, as does Menachem Schneerson and Bar Kokhba, so that is a good point. Bar Kokhba was the only one who was actually a military leader, which is what the Messiah is supposed to be. He's supposed to bring about political, a prince that conquers our enemies. The difference is that Bar Kokhba didn't defeat the Romans defeated him. And Jesus was basically a social movement, and Menachem Schneerson a religious movement. But that is it, right. So they're all different, but this is a very important difference, that Sabbatai Zevi commits apostasy, right, takes another religion. But then the way that it doesn't end the movement, and this is also discussed at the end of the book, that what happens is that some of his disciples see that are scandalized and they see that they were, they open their eyes and they see that they were being misled, which is what one, what's his name? Mordechai Joseph. But then the other disciple, who's Gedalia, right? They say, no. Actually, they still believe in him, because they say that just like the people's experience had to go down to the bottom with the pogroms in order for the redemption to come up, so the Messiah must go to the depths of sin in order to rise up and bring full redemption and establish this mystical tikkun, this fixing of the world. So they believe that it was intentional, that it was in order to mystically bring about the redemption of the world. And that's what's called the Sabbatean heresy, which only applies after he converts to Islam. And there are Sabbateans who continued to observe this, and they ended up being persecuted in the Jewish world. So they kept their belief secret. And there was a big, over the next 100 years, between the middle of the 17th century, middle of the 18th century, that was always, you wanted to accuse someone, you'd call them a Sabbatean. It's like in the 1950s, to call someone a communist. It was like that in the Jewish world. And there was a huge, especially in Germany, there was a huge conflict between two famous rabbis, Emden against Eibeshitz, with Emden accusing Eibeshitz of being a Sabbatean. And actually, he probably was, So, and then the end of the story is it's in the early 18th century that there is another Polish rabbi named Jacob Frank who takes Sabbateanism to its extreme and has a small sect, follows him, and he believes he's the next Messiah that's fulfilling the work that Sabbatai Zevi started, and had secret groups with where they engaged in all kinds of conscious breakings of the law, which included eating non-kosher food, orgiastic rituals, the stuff that's described in this book. That's where Isaac Bashevis Singer took liberties, because those descriptions of the conscious breaking as much laws as you possibly can at one moment, that's really, more of that is from the Frankist movement, but in the popular memory, the Frankist movement which is early 18th century, gets combined with the Sabbatean movement, which is mid 17th century. So there's a mixture of those. The Frankists are inspired by the Sabbateans, but he's taking a liberty in combining those two things in order to tell the story, and make it as dramatic as he can. I don't think there's that much evidence of that type of stuff going on in Sabbatai Zevi. What Sabbatai Zevi did do is he did turn the fast days. He ate on the fast days. He pronounced God's name that we're not supposed to pronounce, the Tetragrammaton, the YHWH, and proclaimed himself the Messiah. And that was enough for it to be controversial in his time, for people to call him a heretic, but other people didn't. But it wasn't that dramatic. It wasn't, oh my God, like the type of rituals observed there. The anger and the fierceness over the Sabbatean controversy, it happens after he converts to Islam, because that's the moment of total despair for half of the people leaving, and then the other half still believing. You had a similar decision point when the Lubavitcher Rebbe died, because the whole Lubavitcher movement believed he was the Messiah. When he died, they kind of split into the Messianists and the non-Messianists, whereas the Messianists believe he is still the Messiah and he'll come back. And the others say, no, he was a great Rebbe and he died. So there's that split in the Lubavitcher movement. You had this split, but not quite as common, because of course the Lubavitcher Rebbe never practiced apostasy the way that Sabbatai Zevi did. I had a few hands. Start here. Yeah.
I haven't read this book, but I have read works by Singer. For me, this book is a reaction to his visceral experience of the Holocaust and being affected by that moment. And I think he uses these massacres in the Ukraine,
Right.
which proceeded 20 years prior, to give some kind of similarity.
Yeah, it's tempting to see it as his reflection of the Holocaust. The problem is the Holocaust hadn't happened yet. He wrote it in 1933. It's before the Holocaust.
He actually wrote it.
He wrote it in 1933. It's before. Yeah. I mean, the Nazis had just come to power, but the Holocaust hadn't happened yet. But look, I mean, Poland wasn't an amazing place for Jews before either. So, but it's before the Holocaust. It hasn't happened. When it's published in English, in translation, at that point, the Holocaust has happened. But when he wrote it in Yiddish, it has not happened.
Another remarkable thing that's the first thing I'll say is I love the idea that he is the dark side of, let's say, a Shalom Aleichem because
Yeah.
of all the trauma,
Yeah.
the violence
Yeah.
that he lived through.
Yeah. The Shalom Aleichem is a great comparison because, it's hard to read this and not think of Fiddler on the Roof, right? Because it takes place in a small town, and at Fiddler, there's it's all beautiful. Both books start with a beautiful, literary description of what Judaism was like in the good old days of the shtetl, and it falls apart. In Fiddler, it falls apart because of the pogrom and the forced exile, which is also kind of dark, right? And here it falls apart because of the apostasy and the sinfulness and the broken relationships that happen. Linda, I'll go across. Yeah, so it's a little right. So it's a little after that. The Jews were a little slow in catching on to those things, but the debauchery, as I said, is historical from the Frankist movement, not necessarily from the Sabbatean movement. But the Frankists in the early 18th century, again, they are Sabbateans. So it's the same movement. It's just spread over a 200-year period that Singer is putting into just 1.5 years with these same people at the time of Sabbatai Zevi. He's contracting it in order to, yeah. Yeah, and we'll talk about that. And the magic, I want to make a point about there's, there are others of his writing, one of the things that, in the original, you have this New York Times review of books from the 1950s, folk material transmuted into literature, is from the New York Times review. You can still find the review online. You can read the whole review. It's mostly as just a summary. So he's very into folk traditions, and a lot of his other writings, he talks about, the Jewish magic, the idea of that. There's only one part of this that's supernatural, and that's when they do the exorcism at the end and the fire comes out of her. That's the only thing. Everything else is plausible. Everything else makes sense, right? Because there's that conversation when the Dybbuk, the spirit, is speaking from her, but that's her, right? She's possessed. But you could read it as she's possessed by a demon, or you could read it that everyone thought she was possessed by the demon, but really she was suffering from mental illness and she's speaking. So they imagine some fire. So someone lit a match. Okay. There's nothing supernatural. And it's the same way that in Fiddler, the only supernaturalism is the dream, right? So here, the supernatural is what they're imagining, but what actually happens is real, right? Again, it's real over different period historical, but it's real. Sharon. Uh-huh.
And it showed lines of people with their suitcases
Uh-huh.
as if they were getting ready to board
Right.
dinner or something.
Yeah.
And you could feel the urgency. Hurry up.
Right. And that happened in 1655. So let me just, and I'll get the other question, just comment on that. So I mentioned Gershom Sholom's major biography of Sabbatai Zevi. It's this thick. As I said, I have it right behind that wall there. Gershom Sholom was the scholar who created the whole field of the study of Jewish mysticism. And he scoured every library in the world for all of these secret documents about the Sabbatean mysticism and all of that. And he read them all, he published them, he found, and they're all written in code, because after Sabbatai Zevi dies, it's a heresy. Right? So it's secret letters going back and forth. And he discovered all of these, and he put together his whole history of the Sabbatean movement based on all of these documents that he found. An extraordinary amount of research. And for him, the Sabbatai Zevi was more, Gershom Sholom was a German Jew who made Aliyah before the Shoah, and was this very strong Zionist. And he believed that 1655 is the beginning of modern Jewish history and the beginning of, because he sees the Sabbatean movement as a proto-Zionist movement. It's proto-Zionist because it unites the whole Jewish people through the whole world. It breaks the Sephardic Ashkenazic barriers, and that the whole Jewish world is looking towards reestablishing a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, which is what the Sabbateans believed the Sabbatai Zevi was going to establish. And the other reason, especially Gershom Scholem, who was a real Zionist, meaning secular, not because today we think of Zionists as being the settlers, Orthodox, right? That was the minority. The real Zionists were secular Jews, right, who saw it as a political movement but seeped in Jewish culture, but not run by rabbis, and that the Sabbatean movement was very important for Rabbi because they made a lot of liberal halachic decisions, right? Not just pronouncing out the Yud Hey Vav Hey, but one of them, and there is historical evidence, and it's in the book. And this is historical because we have the evidence. Gershom Scholem discovered it, that Sabbatai Zevi and his followers permitted women's prayer groups, where women could read from the Torah and take an aliyah, right? And this was, so there were, besides the other leniencies that were taken, and there were leniencies with divorce law, and then obviously with the Frankists, there were a lot of leniencies. I'm not putting that aside. But those under Sabbatai, they were more gradual, the type of leniencies that we have embraced in the non-Orthodox world. Right? So from Gershom Scholem's perspective, it was part of not only the Jewish nationalization of Judaism, but also a secularization of Judaism, right? To break the old bounds of the rabbinic control and to have a modern secular national movement. So that's why the Sabbatai movement is so important for Gershom Scholem and for many. And Singer understands that, and he's writing, it's the in-between, between the old world and the new world. And that's why it's such an important book, because it's in between for Singer, right? He writes it in the old world. 2 years later, he moves across the ocean, and the book was published in Syriac and Yiddish, but it's only widely read once the English translation comes out in 1955 or whenever it came out. So you can see that progression there. Anne, right across. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah. 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 It starts off with a pogrom, where in Shalom Aleichem he ends with the pogrom. Yeah. 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 Did you?
Yes, I did one sitting.
No, it's very grabbing. It's also good because the chapters are so short. Like, read one more. Read one more. 4-page chapters is brilliant, right? Yeah. But it's a good point because it starts bad. You're like, oh my God, well, it starts bad. It can only get better. But no, not necessarily. But right. But on your point on the relation to today, so the translator, Jacob Sloan, he writes in his introduction, he says, certainly we who in our own time have also seen how in Yeats' memorable phrase, the center falls apart, cannot help but be struck by the relevance of Satan in Goray to ourselves and our present situation. He writes that in 1955, but it's like all the more so today. Right? Yeah, because you have these two, right? The centrist, the normal guy is Benish, who he dies, right? I mean, he dies of natural causes, but he's also clear that there's no one that he represents sort of the centrist, normal, rationalist, and there's nobody left, and there's only the extremes after that. And it's the translator picked up on that, and that reads strongly for us. Yeah, Joe.
So
Sorry, then Annette.
When redemption is talked about, what is the assumption that is? Eternal life in, what was Israel, and they're all
Yeah.
together by cloud that lives forever, or what?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ideas, but I think for the most part, because this was popular messianism, so they believed that, they were going to magically get to the land of Israel where the Jews would live happily ever after. Well, they'll be the masters and the non-Jews would serve us. And which in some Zionist versions still is what happens today, right? And but there's also the belief in resurrection of the dead. There's that great passage, and there is this in mystical literature where they had to cry and say goodbye at the cemetery because they knew they'd get to Israel first, because the dead go underground. They don't get to fly on the cloud. So they'll go like underground passages, and then they would just come up like somehow there'll be a hole in the Mount of Olives and they'll make it out there. So so there's resurrection of the dead, there's the end of suffering, there's just, paradise. And that's what they, not the debauchery. That's not the world to come. That's the mystical tikkun, the sense of it was a ritualized sinning that would bring about you had to go to the very bottom in order to get up. It has to be so that's not an image of paradise. Huh? Yes, Annette.
I'm also confused about one thing. It feels like Sabbatai and some of these, just Sabbatai also that created the chaos. Am I wrong? It created chaos in order to get to that bottom.
Right.
It sounds like that. Without
Right.
that Sabbatai, the chaos wouldn't have even
Right. The Sabbatai create the chaos. I mean,
So maybe it's a diabolical scheme to create chaos.
Yeah.
To get people to
it's a question of how intentional it was. So Gershom Sholom's theory, his thesis is that Sabbatai Zevi was mentally ill. He said that he had was manic or depressive, and he reads through and he argues that through the accounts of his life, that he had periods of despondency and then periods of great ebullience and joy, and it was extreme passages. So he identifies that as what he was suffering, but the real creation of the Sabbatarian movement is created by Nathan of Gaza, not by Sabbatai Zevi. Nathan of Gaza sees this crazy guy and who does weird things, and he believes that this must be the Messiah, and then the mystical theorizing of it is all from Nathan of Gaza. Nathan of Gaza also writes the letter. Nathan of Gaza is to Sabbatai Zevi what Paul is to Jesus. The same way where Paul spreads the word.
Well, Nathan allowed the chaos.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
what I'm saying is when you think about a Messiah, then just generalizing this, you have to think of somebody who is in the business of creating chaos.
Yeah.
So that everyone will feel like they're being saved.
The business, right? But the Gershom Sholom's point is that Sabbatai Zevi was chaotic, right? He was just a chaotic personality. He wasn't intentionally trying to create chaos. That was who he was. He personified chaos, right? Yes.
He's responding to hopelessness. They just experienced the worst pogroms until the Holocaust. There was desperation.
Right.
So it's like pardon the expression, but the current president of the United States take advantage of
Right.
despair.
And it works, right? There are some times where the message is heard more than other times. Correct, exactly. And that's his point at the very beginning. That's why he starts with a pogrom. And
What people are hearing is not necessarily what Steve is saying.
right,
It's getting filtered through people spreading the word.
right.
And so you get the
Right.
sitting on the ground,
Right.
being served.
Right.
And so it's a mixture
Right.
of the craziness he
Right.
brings and then old stories
Right.
that people put on.
Right. That
They also desperate.
Yeah, and the way it's heard and spread by others. That was one of the things I thought was so sensibly done in the book, is the way that news is spread. With the emissaries, right? Someone comes into town, says what's going on. You knew there were these delays, and you know that there's So when they say, oh, these crazy things are happening, you know that things are exaggerating because they're being told. So you're the traveler, you embellish the story. So a crowd surrounds you in the inn, and you're telling these things, and there's a kernel of truth, but it's exaggerated. Same thing happens even today, right? So, Linda. Who's he?
the rabbi, the stories.
Oh, of Sabbatai Zevi. Right.
Is that he's
Yeah.
still around?
Still around. Right. Still around. Yeah, he lives. Right. He lives another about 20, 25 years after his apostasy, his conversion to Islam. Let me show you just pound out like a few passages here that I blocked out. So one is the description of Rabbi Bennett, right? And that's sort of the normal, right? That one of the things, he's very learned, but he is lenient in some areas and strict in others. He's lenient on the aguna, right? The woman who's a chained woman because her husband is missing. And he, it says, was one who construed the law liberally, gave permission, people would come, he would find ways to give wives these permission to remarry. And there's the tremendous contrast there, because what Gedalia does, he gives permission for these orgiastic rituals, right, and annulment of adultery, which is also a permission, but a very different permission that Rabbi Benish gives. Although Rabbi Benish, difference for Benish also, there's this great line on 13 when he says, the bitter persecutions of the years 1648 and 49 had reawakened in Benish the old paradoxes regarding faith, predestination, freedom of will, and the suffering of the virtuous. Right, that these are the key questions. And although, again, he's writing before the Holocaust, but it's impossible for us not to read it from our perspective, post-Shoah, that those are the main theological questions of our day, right? And since the Holocaust, right? How does God allow this, right? And those, but he's prefiguring that into Benish. So everyone's struggling with that, but Benish struggles with it also. Yehodo, these references to the stories of Sabbatai Zevi being crowned by the other Jews across the river Sambation. So this is a part of in Jewish mystical mythology that the Sambation is this mystical river that separates our world from the world that we can't reach, right? And that's where the 10 lost tribes are. It's like very far into Asia, and where you have stories, but no one ever goes there. And if you go, do you believe? It's like Marco Polo, right? So they're coming over the Sambation when the lost Israelites come back and unite under a Messiah that we can follow also. So that's the reverse of the ancient exile, because the 10 lost tribes are lost when the Assyrians conquer the kingdom of Israel, in the most ancient period. It goes back to 722 BCE. So that's what that reference is to the river Sambation. And then it talks about the Chmielnicki massacres as the birth pangs of the Messiah. So that's a very important image. Why do we have to suffer first? Because it's a birth pang. That's why in much of, in the secular Zionist story, it's the birth pangs of the establishment of Israel is the Holocaust, right? Even though, of course, Zionism existed before the Holocaust, right? The first Zionist Congress, 1896, but that's the birth pang that was necessary in order for the state to be established. Sorry? Original sin? Yeah, I guess why do you have to have original sin? Because then you get redeemed from it. That's good. Yeah. Right. That's true. And in Thomas Mann's Joseph tetralogy, he says how it's the Joseph story, it's also the Jesus story. Thomas Mann presents it as like the basic religious myth that you go down to a pit and then you come up out of it. Right, you go, because Joseph is literally in a pit, and then he rescues, and then he's in prison, and he comes out of prison. So there's that going down and coming back up, which is the story of Sabbatai with the apostasy to Islam that goes there. There's talks about how people are. There's a passage on 17. Young people are studying the mysteries of the divine chariot in the book of Ezekiel. So those are the two classical sources of Jewish mysticism in the Bible. That Ezekiel is the divine chariot is the sense of the image of God's chariot, and then the other passage is the story, the creation of the world. But those are the passages that you're not supposed to study if you're under 40 years old. And we joke about that when the Haftorah comes up. I say, "Are you 40 yet?" So there's this indulgement in mysticism, and Benish doesn't like it. And it says Benish himself was a student of philosophy, well-versed in the Guide for the Perplexed, right? So he was a rationalist. He's an anti-mystical. And then on the next page, he said he also ordered his children to read the biblical prophets in writing until they had memorized them. He taught the boys Hebrew grammar, although in Poland that was considered almost apostasy. Studying the Hebrew, the Nach, right? The later parts of the Bible in Hebrew grammar, that's the Haskalah. That's the educational program of Jewish Enlightenment that doesn't happen to the early 18th century. So again, he's pushing it here, Isaac Singer. He's contrasting the time, but he's presenting Benish as not only a traditional rabbi, but also a maskil, as an enlightened Jew, because that's modern Jewish education, where and it shows that it's the centered rationalist approach as opposed to the mystical approach, and in a sense, Isaac Bashevis Singer is rebelling against that because his father was a Hasidic rabbi. He went to a Hasidic yeshiva for a while and then he left it. So he made his break with the Hasidic, as Hasidism is the mystical world. And Singer left that world, but he still remembers, his relationship with it is mixed, right? There's a nostalgia, but there's also a bitter separation from it too. Yeah. In my father's court, right? The yeshiva, the Hasidic court. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I had not allowed to look in a long time. Yeah. So he talks about on page 22. He gives a good tonight with his like everything was great, and then he's talking about how everything was great before. It's the chapter called the Old Goray and the New. Goray is a real town, by the way, and I looked, and it's near Lublin, and it's just a small town. It's got a population of about 1,000 people. But I looked it up on Wikipedia. There's not much, it has a little picture of the town square. And then I don't think it had as large of a Jewish community as presented here, but it did have a synagogue in it in the old days and a church. But then it's a very small Wikipedia article. But then when you click in literature, whatever, then of course Satan Goray comes up. So this is the most famous part but it is a real town. So he then switches and then says, of course there were misfortunes. Then he says how everything that had all these problems before the problems, which is the great thing about nostalgia. You remember everything so wonderful and it wasn't. And one of the problems was a halachic dispute, which is great, that it said that when a woman, and it also has to do with sexual permission because divorce, right? A divorce allows a woman to marry another man, that when she needed a divorce, they had to go to the next town. They couldn't issue the gets in Goray because Goray was on 2 rivers. And when you write a get, you identify the town as near the river blank. It's like we say Ridgewood, New Jersey, right? We would say Ridgewood on the Hohokus Brook. Is that the thing there? Whatever, that's what we would say. So I've never written a get here. The Gittin that, a lot of us do that, my colleague Rabbi Joel Pitkowski from Teaneck, so right, it says Teaneck on the river Hackensack, right? That's the way. And you think about it, that's from the old Jewish European standards. It's like Frankfurt on the Main and Frankfurt on the Oder. You don't say Frankfurt in Hesse and Frankfurt in Pomer, whatever the town, the state is there. You identify it. That goes way back to the Middle Ages, that when you different towns the same name, you identify it by the river. So because Goray was on 2 rivers, no one could decide which was the primary river, and you need a standard for how to write it in a get. And then it comes up later in the book on 143, when now Gedalia is, although Levi, Benish's son, is technically the rabbi, but Gedalia is really the rabbi. And among the different things he did, it says it says that this was when he forced Itchamates to divorce Rechele so he could marry her, and says, nor did they mind that the river of Goray had 2 names, meaning they wrote the get in Goray, right? He was liberal, and rather than sending her, and then you're supposed to wait 90 days, and he said, nor did he, and he passed the 90-day, and he married her the very next day, right? Because he was in a big rush to marry Rechele. Why is there a 90-day waiting period after a woman has a get before she can remarry? as a child, right? Because the issue of paternity. Because if you wait 3 months, then there's no issue of paternity. So that's why it's a mandatory 3-month waiting period between a get and the next marriage. Okay, so let me go forward a little bit more. See what I highlighted here. So it says Rabbi Benish would roll up the sleeves of his coat. This is the other side, and he would rule according to the strict letter of the law, reckoning with no one. More than one Sabbath Eve, Grunim the beadle had to go rapping from shutter to shutter with the news that the bathhouse was unclean, and the men were to stay away from the women who had been there that day. They decided there was a problem with the mikveh, so it didn't count, so no relations tonight. Which again is the opposite of the events that happen at the end of the book. So there's always this so even in the first chapters, these are all foreshadowing. It's the flip side of what's going to happen. So it's amazing how tightly it's constructed, even though it's published in series, that way. And then he discovered too late that he had ruled an animal kosher when it was not, and half the housewives of the town had to smash their earthen vessels, scald the iron ones, and pour the soup and meat into the swill heap. If he decided, I said it was kosher, oh no, it wasn't kosher. So the earthen vessels you have to break because you can't kosher it. You break it and put it back together. The metal vessels you put in scalding water. So the point is the pots had to be koshered because they decided the meat wasn't kosher. That also foreshadows Gedaliah, because when Gedaliah comes and becomes the shochet, it says he never declared anything treif. Everything was kosher. So that's why the butchers loved him. He won the super butcher because they didn't lose any money, because sometimes, this animal's no good, So again, it foreshadows that. But it also shows that Benish is balanced as a rabbi, that he's lenient for a gunot where it makes a difference, but he's strict when it doesn't make a difference, right? So the people can't have sex that night. They could wait another night, right? What's the big deal? So an earthen pot is not expensive. A dish, you break it, you can glue it back together. These are not terrible losses, and it shows the balance. And it was something that when I was in rabbinical school, I learned from my teacher, Rabbi Joel Roth, who taught us Jewish law. He said that when you're making halakhic decisions, you can't say yes if the people asking you wouldn't listen to you if you said no. That's like, you can't say, I can't tell you, yes, it's okay, if you wouldn't listen to me if I told you it's not okay. So that it has to be, that the religious sizer has to be balanced, right? And you have to know, and you have to say no on some things. You can't say yes for everything. Exactly. Then what's the point? So that's why Benish had to be strict in some areas, so that in other areas he could legitimately be lenient. And that's a balanced approach to Jewish law, which is obviously the opposite of what happens later in the book. Okay, let me just see. Okay, hold on. Okay. The idea of when Itchamatis, he checks the mezuzah, right, and he finds that God's name is missing, and the S, the shin, the top of the shin, it's a great thing. You can see him, it's like, because it's part of you inspect the mezuzah, and then you see something strange here, and it's the connection with the Sabbatean movement, because Shabtai was all obsessed with the different emanations of God's name, and you see that in Jewish mysticism even to this day, right? The focus on the different ways that the reading or the presentation of the Tetragrammaton, the holy name of God. So that's presented there. So in page 61, there's this letter to Ashkenazi from a rabbi in Lublin, and it's saying how this is a terrible thing happening. He's the anti-Sabbatean. And he says, I have heard the tidings, and pangs and throes assailed me as a woman in labor. Right? So that's a reference to the piyut, Eli Tzion, which we sing on Tisha B'Av. Eli Tzion ve'areha. Right? Zion's city is destroyed the pain is like a woman in the pains of labor. That's kamo isha v'tzireya, like a woman in her pains. So it's a reference to the Tisha B'Av liturgy, that he just snuck in there. And it's the sense of this impending destruction, right? And it also goes to your point, right? He's writing this, the Holocaust hasn't happened, but the Nazis just came to power. So he knows things were bad, and there's this foreboding that things are going to get worse. And Isaac Bashevis Singer he obviously did feel that way, because he leaves Poland He can't convince his wife to go with him. So he breaks his marriage and he moves to America because he has this great foreboding that something terrible is going to happen in Poland. And he was right.
The book is not published until the 50s.
No, the Yiddish is published at the time. He published it in Poland at the time. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. There's a direct scene in Fiddler on the Roof compares. This is on page 71 when Hinkel at the betrothal party for Yitzchak Matis and Rechele when they start dancing and then the mechitza breaks down. And it's just like Fiddler on the Roof, right? The wiping is wet for his sleeve. Yitzchak Matis arose, approached Chinkele, who's the pious woman, and he draws his handkerchief from his breast pocket, held one corner of it, said the Chinkele, speaking out of the side of his mouth, was not to address her directly, because he can't, and he says, take a corner, it's pleasing to the blessed God for us to dance before him. And then they all start dancing. So it's this tentative dancing, but it's the groom with another woman, not with his bride. Because Rechele can't dance because she's lame, right? So it's also a foreboding of, and then it's the joke of it lead to mixed dancing, right? So obviously the mixed dancing leads to a lot worse. But in Shalom Aleichem, it's the breaking down of the traditional mores. In here, it's the breaking down of the traditional mores for the total opposite of the mores that happens at the end of the. It happens in the later part of the book. Do you like how Benish dies? Is it how he forsakes his congregation? Right? He says, I don't want to be buried here. Take me back to Lublin. He obviously dies as soon as he gets to Lublin. And he knew he was dying before he went out in the storm. But there's the sense that it's a tragic death because he was the respected leader and he was trying to hold back the Sabbatean trend that he wasn't able to. And then he loses in his strength. He obviously has some kind of stroke when he goes out in the wind, and then he's dying. And he goes and they take him to Lublin, and he dies in Lublin. So it's powerful that that's a main character that dies at the end of the first part, right? And then he's replaced with Gedalia because Dalia doesn't make an appearance until part 2. So you have those two. So that contrasts, right, Benish with Gedalia, right? You have these two. One is only in the first part, one is only in the second part, and they're opposite type of religious leaders, right? One is centered, rational, and the other one is radical and mystical and extremist and all of that. So there's the account of the wedding, and what do you get about the fact that Yitzchak Matis is not able to consummate the marriage when you have part of it contrasts with the orgiastic rituals that happen at the end? It makes Yitzchak Matis sort of a comic character, right? But it's also, I think he's contrasting different types of extreme, over-the-top piety, right? That you have Yitzchak Matis, who's so extreme, he won't be with his wife. And then you have Gedalia, who's and Levi, who are so extreme that they do the opposite, right? And they're with everyone. But both, right, the debauchery or the asceticism are both sides of the same thing, right? They're mystical extremism expressed in opposite ways, but it's the same instinct, right? And neither are normal, is I think that's what I read. What I read it there. Okay, then we're introduced to Gedalia, and yes.
All of this feels to me at the end of the day that I think that Singer was saying that messiahs don't exist.
The what doesn't exist?
Messiahs do
Okay.
not exist. Magic doesn't exist. It's all how you perceive, and it's all such a farce, and get over it.
Yeah, he's saying
That's what he's saying.
tragedy because people get carried away with
We make it our own.
right, and we see our day, and he saw it right. Okay, it's before the Holocaust, but he witnessed what happens before he published it is that Adolf Hitler comes to power, and that's crazy, right? How does a crazy, irrational person who breaks every standard and every tradition of politics come to power in one of the most powerful countries in the world, right? I mean, it was, that's what he witnessed. And he knew, so I think it's a story about that also, that people get carried away with the movement because people are unhappy with the world as it is. And it's, and they don't, and they suffer. And they look for an easy
But the
answer.
Messiah, he's presenting the Messiah as an out, but he's saying in the end, it doesn't exist. He's presenting magic as an out. He's saying it doesn't exist. So you
Because
It's like
Isaac
a
Bashevis Singer identifies with Rabbi Benish as the tragic
Exactly,
hero.
yeah.
He's the normal rabbi.
Right.
And that's what Isaac Bashevis Singer is saying. That's what the translator says. That the center is gone. We have to find a way to put the center back. Right? A Messiah is someone who says, I have been sent by God, which is not a normal thing to say, even in an normal place, right? I mean, never been said before. But that's messianic, right? And that's why he's saying that messianic is a fervor. It's important to understand it. And sometimes good things. A lot of people say that Chabad does a lot of good things. Right? Jews argue about Chabad all the time. And say, well, yeah, they're a little crazy, but they do a lot of good things. Okay? And then there were some things that the Sabbatai movement did that weren't good, like getting women on the oath. Now, I don't know if that was really such an influence for the development of egalitarianism here, because it's divided by 300 years, from 1650s to 1950s. But nevertheless, Gershom Shalom is trying to make the connection.
Yeah, but that's even extremism has a marketing look.
Yeah.
That's the marketing look.
So let me finish up quickly because I think my high school class starting very soon. But it's in chapter, it's this 116, he talks about the 10 women gathered for the prayer form's minion. He should have said minion in the translation, prayer form. And a woman cantor stood behind the lectern chanting the Shabbos prayers. 7 women called up to the lectern to read. I mean, that's extraordinary, right? And that's historical. That's historical that happened. And then there are so many things in that. So on page 118, it says there's this progression of what they're doing there, where it said that since the beginning of the slaughter of Goray had never once found any beast to be unclean and unfit to be eaten. Developed. So that's the first step. Now that's plausible, unlikely, but plausible. Then it says he permitted women to go to the bathhouse and then to bed with their husbands soon after menstruation. According to him, they did not have to keep the additional 7 days of abstinence. That is an actual change of halakha. That is a liberalization of halakha. It's actually something that the conservative movement says, the Orthodox don't. It's in the observance of ritual purity. There's the time that the woman's bleeding, and then when she stops bleeding, she can go to the mikveh. If it's nidah, if it's something called zava, which is an irregular flow, she has to count, according to the Torah, 7 days of no bleeding until she can go to the mikveh. And in the Gemara, in the Talmud, it says that the women of Israel took upon themselves to be strict, because they didn't know the difference between being a nidah, being a zava, a regular flow, and an irregular flow. And they said, let's everyone wait for 7 white days until they go to the mikveh. So in the Orthodox world, it's usually almost 2 weeks. It's either like 5 plus 7, right? That you have the period of abstinence between the husband and the wife, and that's a stricture. And in the conservative movement, for those who do, and this is a small group who do, observe family purity, the teaching in the conservative movement has been we don't have to observe that stricture. That we can follow, we know the difference between regular and irregular, and you can just go to the mikvah once the menstrual flow stops. So that's a liberalization of halakha, which is not law, because that's not law in the Orthodox. We didn't have our permission then. So that's step 2 that Singer is writing. So first is plausible but unlikely. Second is actually liberalization of law. Then the third level is he explained to young nations ways to inflame their husbands and whisper in their ears that ever since Sabbatai Zevi was revealed, the commandment against adultery was void. Okay, that's the third step. So that's all in one paragraph. But it's so brilliantly written because it progresses from plausible to liberalization to total antinomian, right? Where you're taking the law and turning it upside down. And you have to know about the different laws, because the law against adultery is black and white, and it completely turns it around. So that all happened there. And then they would, and then it says at the end of the next paragraph, the young men would climb into the women's gallery in the middle of the day, committing pederasty with one another and sodomy, M dash, with the goats. So you have homosexuality and bestiality committed in the women's gallery in synagogue, right? So that's, you have adultery and bestiality, which are the three. The only thing missing is incest, but they have incest elsewhere. So those are all in the chapter 18 of Leviticus. They're considered the worst things that you can do. There's three things that are so, that the breaking of them in Jewish law are so severe that you can't even say, you're not allowed to claim compulsion to do it. You can't claim that someone was forcing me to do this. I know I'm late for the guys, so be right back.
You are teaching.
I am.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so I'm going to be about 5 minutes late.
That's okay. I'll just let them know.
Okay. So, and it's murder. You're not allowed to say the mob boss is going to kill me unless I kill this thing, knock off this guy. Right? It's murder, idolatry, and the sexual crimes of Leviticus 18. So we put the sexual crimes here. They're not doing murder because the Sabbatai were crazy, but they weren't really evil. They're just crazy, right? But they didn't hurt anybody. I mean, broke some marriages, but didn't hurt anybody. Marriage, not murder. So, and then at the end of the book, it's two wandering beggars who come to Goray, decided to marry, and married they were by some mischief makers on the donkey. It's two guys, right? So there's the same-sex marriage at the end of the book also, and this is way before we came against Bashevis in 1933. So that was a great chapter with a lot going on there, and then. At 125, it says, Gedalia and Levi had released from marriage all women who had been deserted. So whereas Benesh was trying to find the ways halakha, they just released them all. So it goes further than the liberalism that, the outside of the halakha system. You just declare that they're not bound by their marriages, anything that that's it. Then finally, the apostasy of Sabbatai Zevi is presented. And I thought the way he presented it was brilliant because it presented through the voices of two former believers, right? And you can see them how they changed at the end, and then the struggle between them and Gedalia at the end, I talked about the observance of the Frankists. It matches what Frankists did. When, especially Nephila's wife, right, is engaging in everything, the foreshadowing, in fact, she was having relations with everyone. She's not Nephila's wife, Nephila, Levi's wife, the rabbi's wife, right? But that's foreshadowed in the beginning because it says she's so private, the curtains are always drawn. And then the opposite happens when her clothing is always open and she's everywhere in front of everybody. And, so it's foreshadowed by the opposite in the first half of the book. And it only gets very explicit until you get to the very end. So get there, it's good. And then at the end when it says, the faithful went so far as to write the government charging their opponents with disloyalty. Now that's at the end. He doesn't go into detail then. That also goes to the Frankists. It's not the Sabbatai, but there's a big debate over what did the Frankists do that was so terrible, that was so scandalous. They had the Ausch parties in the early 18th century. They would close the inn and all their followers and all kinds of things would happen there. But a lot of the scholars, I read a whole book on the Frankists by a contemporary Polish Jewish scholar, and he argues that wasn't the most scandalous thing they were condemned to Jewish Romans. Like, okay, they do their own thing over there, but it doesn't affect anybody else. It's just what we're going to do. But what they did do that was scandalous is that they wrote to the government and they accused the Jews, the anti-Frankists, of killing young Christians. The Blood Bible, right? They already used the blood of the Christian boy from Matzah, and they were trying to get their opponents arrested because their opponents were excommunicated Frankists. Again, when I said let them be, I mean they did excommunicate them. So, but they're not trying, but So that was, and he doesn't go into detail on that. You might, Singer might not have been aware of the details of the history of the Frankist movement, but that was by telling the government, by telling on other Jews to the government. That's the worst. That's the bottom of the bottom. Now you can't get worse than that. It's like, it's when you have disputes among ourselves, that's one thing. But when you go and battle, and it's obviously a lie. So we know that. And let's just take 1 second about the last 2 chapters. Literally, it's amazing, right? How it switches around. The style changes. And it changes to an older form of English, right? Which I don't know how that's captured in the Yiddish, but he's writing in the style of an old Yiddish rabbinic explanation of the story of the Dibbick, right? And then the exorcism, and it ends with an exorcism. And the way it's told, it's just a different perspective. So it gives it's from the perspective of the anti-Sabbatarians. And again, you have all this literature back and forth for 200 years of the Sabbatarians and anti-Sabbatarians, going back and forth. And then the account of the exorcism and the conversation with the Dibbick, which is really a conversation with the Rebbe herself, right? And you know that it's hinted because she says the Dibbick did all of these things, and then they go and they arrest the Dahlia. So they know that she's really talking about the Dahlia because he's the one who abused her. That's correct, right? Even though it doesn't tell us that, you can read between the lines. And there's one also, just a very technical line, it's on 61, when it says, "On Yom Kippur I made a feast for spite and drank wine and gave myself to unbridled desire, and I also laid with beasts, animals, and fowls. Woe is for me, I said in my heart, there is neither justice nor judgment, I denied that the Torah is from heaven." Now, when she says, "I made a feast on Yom Kippur," like some seculars or else Jews do that, and sometimes it's specifically because they want to do the opposite of what the halacha says. And there's 2 types of transgression in Jewish law. There's transgression that's called the te'avon, which means your appetite, because you attempted to do something. And then there's transgression lahakis, which means intentional, right? It's not because I have an appetite for it, it's because I specifically want to violate the law. And that's what she says. She says, I had this feast for spite, not because she was hungry, but it was to spite. She wanted to undo Yom Kippur. And I ate, and I lay with beasts, animals, and fowls. Okay, not with animals, but it's also very technical. Beasts, animals, and fowls, because in the laws of shkita, of slaughter, there's 4 types of animals: coyote, behemoths, and ofo. Wild animals, domesticated animals, and fowls. And there's different rules for how to check those different kinds of animals. Her husband, Vidalia, is a shochet, and she mentions all 3. So again, it's just brilliant. Like, this is in between the texts. It's so halakhic, and yet a total upturning of it in the most obscure way. And then, of course, you have it ends with the exorcism, and then, of course, she dies after it. And then you have that prayer at the end, which is just a normal prayer, so it goes back to this normalization at the end there.
2 real stories about Isaac Bashevis Singer. In 1970.
Hold on a second. Sorry, I got excited, walked away from the microphone. So for the recording, sorry, I summarized the end of the book. Okay. Uh-huh.
Pick him up in the morning, take him to school, and Bashevis Singer told him what he did was he wrote the Yiddish in the evening, and then the next day he would translate himself into English and tighten it up. The other thing is, when he found out my brother was living in this world with girls, he turned to my brother and says, "Well, you sleep with all of them, don't you?" And my brother was working. "Oh, I know."
Yeah. But it,
literature because he tried to be as real
yeah.
as a human being
Yeah.
could be, and it was recognized outside of the Jewish world, which if you watch him speak sometimes, he will say, I didn't know anything else.
Yes.
It was my entire life.
Yeah.
I couldn't write about Texans. I didn't know anything
Right.
about them.
Right.
It was his world, it was our world, but he tried to open
Right.
it up.
Right. So that's why I tried to point out some of the technical things that you wouldn't be clear, because they're references to technical halachic things and others. But overall, you still get the flavor without those, and it's just extraordinary. Last point, I have a class. You like the book? So okay, and if you're welcome. So March 23rd. We'll do Joshua Cohen's The Netanyahus. We got the Nobel for Isaac Bashevis singer after the Netanyahus came out. Joshua Cohen's a young American Jewish author, very, very different, and he got the Pulitzer Prize after that book came out. And then we're going to do the Philip Roth book, they're going to add the date May 18th for the third one. So, what? I can't hear you. I did. I just don't remember. I did pick. It's in the original flyer.
I haven't started it, so